All right, guys, I am going to start and attempt to get this 2-inch leveling kit into my truck. Now, I've never done this before, but the concept is there and I'm pretty mechanical, so I think I can figure it out. Anyway, what I got was leveling kit, into a 2.5-inch leveling kit, I think, actually, in a 2020 Chevy Silverado, part number 12,000. Maybe it's just 2 inches. It's 2 inches. It is rings that go over the struts. You do have to take the struts apart in order to get these in there. So I'll go over that. I've never done this before, but I understand the concept, so we'll go through it together. Some hardware kits, just some tools you're gonna need. Obviously, that's the leveling kit. A set of strut compressors off of Amazon, floor jack, some jack stands, various ratchets. I actually have an air ratchet, which will make my life a little easier. A pen to mark the strut, or a marker. Axle, CV, nut, sockets. I think that this truck is the 36-inch one, which is pretty big, but I have the whole kit. Just a tray to hold my nuts and screws. A torque wrench to torque down the CV nuts. An air ratchet, an air gun, and just a regular battery gun, and compressor, obviously. So I think that's it. I think that's all I'm gonna need. Again, never done this, so this will be my first go at it, and we'll see how it goes. All right, so stock height. I'm on fairly level ground here, so I've got like just over 37, just under 37, 36 and 15/16 to the fender when I go from the center of the wheel. Let me just check out the other side here. Should be about the same. Oh, that's a little more actually, so maybe I'm not on level ground, but that's okay. 37 and 11/16, just under 11/16. Again from the center wheel, so 38, just over 38. All right, so I got the first wheel off the ground, jack stand for safety. So now we're just gonna take this wheel off, put the lug nuts aside to get the wheel out of the way, and start in on the CV and the brake lines. So, all right, so next step is to mark the shock. So I wasn't sure exactly where they wanted me to mark it, if they wanted me to mark the spring and the support, or if they wanted me to mark the spring, the shock, and the support. So I just went right down with that red mark right there. The green one was already there. I don't know, that must have been from install. But that red mark, because I think at some point in this installation, we have to rotate these things 180 degrees. So this is just a reference point. Next thing they want me to do is take off the ABS sensor, which is a 10mm socket. This being a new truck, makes it nice and easy. So take off the ABS sensor here. Just the bracket for it, not the whole sensor. I'm gonna actually just put the screw right back in so I don't lose it. Looks like there might be one back here too. Yep, sure is. So same thing. Back here. Oops, going the wrong way here. All backwards. Standard rookie mistake, right? Okay, so I got that one off. There's the ABS right there. So I don't think we want to take the whole ABS off. It doesn't really specify. I think it just wants the brackets off. So I'm just taking off the brackets here. Again, put that screw right back in. Sorry about the camera angle here. I'm trying to work and do this at the same time. And then the actual brake line bracket, which is right here, also needs to be removed. So now that kind of releases everything from the drop arm here. Okay, so all those are in. I think now we need to take this brake, the brake caliper off on this whole system. So these are those big brake calipers that usually give trouble with clearance on tires, but I'm not replacing tires, so I'm just gonna go ahead and slide that off. Be right back. All right, so I didn't have to take off the brake pad yet, but I think it is in the next step. But I did have to disconnect this tie rod. So one thing I just ran into, this bolt right here is sort of long. So my regular socket fits it, but you can see there's really no room to actually get the drive in it. So I didn't end up using that, but luckily it's a new truck. So I used my trusty adjustable and broke this loose. So now this is loose, sort of. I mean, I undid it a bunch, and now you're supposed to leave this on a little bit and wrap on the side of this to get the tie rod end out. So let's see how that works. Okay, so should be good, I would say. There it is. Okay, so she's loose now. You're just gonna make sure you don't destroy the tie rod end here. So now I think I can go the rest of the way. Get this out of the way here. So I don't really know how I'm gonna hook that up. Maybe I'll use a regular socket to torque it up later. But I'll throw this in the bucket. And there we go. Okay, so we're loose. All right, so tie rod is removed, just kind of hanging there. Next step is to remove the axle CV nut. This does require a special tool. I got this at Harbor Freight. I think it was like 60 bucks for the kit. So it is a true 36 millimeter for the 2020 Silverado. So that's what we're gonna do. I don't think on the other Silverados you actually have to do this part, but we're gonna do it the way it says in the instructions. And next step is to remove the lower nut from the sway bar link, which is this guy right here. So sway bar link, here's the sway bar that goes across the truck, and here is the lower nut, and it says to loosen but don't remove. So we'll go ahead and do that. All right, that is removed, and I did have issues with the shallow socket again, but I was able to get just enough bite to make that work. So it did say to remove it. So now I have to loosen, but don't remove the upper ball joint nut. Carefully strike the steering knuckle with a hammer until the upper ball joint becomes loose. Remove the upper ball joint nut and detach the knuckle from the upper control arm. Okay, so that's this guy. So now we need to remove that nut and strike this knuckle here until it comes loose. All right, that one popped out nice and easy. I did it with an impact gun and almost lost my finger there. So when you loosen that, the weight of this whole apparatus wants to pull out of that ball joint. So I didn't even have to whack it, but I did. Luckily I left that on, but it's only on a couple of threads. So this thing's barely holding on right now. So I guess that makes sense. But we're gonna move on to the next step, which is locate the plastic wire harness channel top on top of the passenger side coilover mount. Push it back to allow access to the 3 coilover nuts. So I'm assuming that's up there. I don't know how we're gonna get up to those. This is gonna be interesting. Does this thing move? Oh yeah, okay, we can get to them. All right, that last one's gonna be interesting. I think I might have to go from the top of the vehicle to get to that third one, but we're gonna give her a shot. Remove and save the 2 lower coilovers and remove the entire. Remove and discard the coilover nuts. Okay, so now we gotta get those 3 nuts. There's only 2 you can see there. I think the other one you have to get from the engine bay. So I'll report back. So I'm on top of the vehicle. Now this is a diesel, so that's why there's a lot of wrapping here. But if you notice down here, that's the nut I'm after, but it's covered by this little plastic connector that holds this wire harness. So I'm just going to use a pair of needle nose to get that off. And then I ended up borrowing a 18mm deep socket from my buddy and made this long extension to hook to my impact wrench so that I can get down out and around that thing. And there we go, that's what it looks like off. Okay, so we do have this plastic piece here. I just used a pry bar to pry it up in the center so that I could get to these nuts here that are now off, but here's what it was that was on there. And as you can see, there's not a whole lot of space there, but once you pry that up, this is just plastic and it's just a bracket for the wire harnesses to ride in. So you're not going to hurt anything by just prying up a little bit here and here underneath these fins. Gives you just enough leverage to get that after it's loose. 18mm, by the way, so you have to use an open-ended wrench to get the front two, and then from the engine compartment remove that little plastic bracket and use a deep socket to get over the last one. And the system says to discard these, but I'm going to hang on to them because I know at some point we have to cut these down a little bit, and I'm going to throw this back on before I cut, as long as I have enough space, so that when I unscrew this, the threads don't get all screwed up. So when I have to put the new nuts that come with the kit on it, the threads are nice and clean. Okay, next step according to the instruction, remove the two lower bolts that hold the strut assembly on. All right, after remove those two bolts, we take the whole strut assembly out. Now what I had to do was kind of push down on this a little bit, this whole apparatus just a little bit, just to kind of take the bottom of that strut, push it that way, drop it down, and then pull the top out this way, and here we are. So now this bracket is supposed to go in here. I've got to figure out how. I think I need to compress this first and then rotate this 180 degrees and then put the bracket on. So I'm going to read the instructions now, and we'll go in the shop to do that. All right, so we're at the workbench now. So next step is to take these nuts that come in the package. Here's the nut for the other side. Okay, take two. So we're in the shop now, and the next step is to take this nut here, which comes in the package. It's a 10mm nut, and throw it on the studs that are a part of the strut. What we're gonna do is we need to cut these bolts. Now originally I had saved the nuts that came on these, but I'm gonna use the ones that came in the package instead. And we need to cut these to the depth of the spacer, which I'm assuming is 7/8 of an inch or so. The reason for that is eventually they're going to sit in these brackets. So these little holes are going to go over the strut like that. And as you can see, those stick out. So we want these off here. And actually, while I have that there, I'm going to go ahead and mark it with the marker. I'm going to go grab the marker and mark it. And that's just so that this spacer can sit flush against the mount in the truck. So we have to get rid of the tops of these bolts. Like I said, this will sit in here, and then we'll have new bolts, these guys, that will poke through to mount the strut back into the truck. So bear with me and I'll show you what it looks like when... All right, so I went ahead and cut these little heads off of there. I'm not about to touch them because they are extremely hot at this point. But now I'm gonna go ahead and undo these nuts, which should fix the threads, and then attach the spacer. Okay, spacer is on. So now you can see these heads are actually flush. So in there you have the nut. I put a little bit of Loctite on there because the instructions called for it. And I torqued these down to 45 foot-pounds. So each one is 45 foot-pounds of torque. So I also noticed that there's no more studs here, so I had to double check the instructions, but apparently these screws will be what replace, and I'm not sure I like that, but these screws are actually going to go down from the top into the strut. So at least it'll be easier to get a ratchet on there and the torque wrench, but that's kind of the idea of how that's going to work. So that's done. So now at this point, because, all right, so this is always a question on these videos, so I'm going to try to explain it. So you have these 3 studs, which normally these are the holes that get mounted, but because these now get mounted to the spacer, these get mounted to the truck, and these are in the wrong position, right? So you would expect 1 to be here and 2 to be down here. So what we have to do is we have to rotate this strut 180 degrees, which will actually put these 2 down here and this one up here, putting these new holes in the right position again, so that when you go to put it back in the truck, everything is lined up again. I've also heard of guys using the passenger side and the driver's side interchangeably so that they line up. And you may ask, well, why can't I just spin this around and put it in the truck? Well, the problem is that these mount points down here, this isn't a single bolt down here. So if you were to rotate this 180 degrees, see how they have sort of an angle to them? So that angle will actually be the wrong way on the truck. It'll end up going this way instead of this way, and therefore you will not be able to mount the bottom of the strut on the truck. And I actually saw a video where a guy literally quit and just stopped installing his lift kit because of that. So what I have to do is use the strut compressors to compress this strut just a little bit, so that I can rotate this 180 degrees, and that is why they have you make that line. So if I use that line, and as I rotate this strut, make sure that they're opposite each other, 180 degrees, we should be good. So I'll let you know how that goes. Okay, so I've got the strut compression, the spring compressors, on the strut, and they're just snug right now. They're not, I haven't really started tightening them down yet, which I've heard horror stories about these things. So if you do not know what you're doing here, don't. Bring it to a shop, have them compress this. I feel a little bit safer about this because I'm not compressing it all that much, and I'm not actually taking the strut apart. I'm just compressing it enough to rotate that strut, to rotate the shock rather in the strut. So I'm just gonna go a little bit. Actually, these compressors do not, I think they're made for cars, because these don't actually close, even though they're supposed to, lock this in here. But again, because I'm only compressing just a little bit, I feel pretty confident that I'm gonna be okay here. So I'll let you see what that looks like. But once you do have it compressed, you wanna switch back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And it says to use hand tools, don't use an impact wrench, even though that makes it a heck of a lot quicker. It adds an element of danger. If you compress one of these too much and then you don't do the other one, these things can get pretty wonky and pretty scary, because once this is under a load, it can actually kill you if it comes off of this, or if something, just bangs loose. So I am gonna do it by hand with this 3/4 inch ratcheting wrench, and it's gonna take me a little bit, and I'll be right back. Okay, so strut compressors are on. I just started loosening them. They were compressed, but remember the mark we made earlier? It's this mark. The important part of that mark was actually on the spring, which I don't know if you can see it, but yeah, I guess you can, right here. So I made another mark on this side, basically 180 degrees from the mark that we made on this side, and I spun this around. One thing that I found was I wasn't quite sure how far to compress the springs, and I didn't want to overdo it. So I compressed it probably about that much on these compression bolts. And then I took these little brackets that sit on here. I took those off just with a screwdriver, a big screwdriver. And then I put this into the vise, and that allowed me, or gave me enough leverage to actually spin it by hand by holding the spring and letting the vise hold the shock, and then I was able to spin that 180 degrees. So that's a trick if you're trying to do that. And now I just need to loosen these left, right, left, right, left, right until that spring is uncompressed. But Again, be careful with this part. I did end up using an impact wrench. I would only recommend using an actual like ratcheting device, but it does take forever if you do it that way. So just be careful and pay attention and you should be fine. All right, so in the instructions, it says locate the factory bump stop tab on the upper control arm frame mount. Using a cutoff wheel, remove this tab completely off the mount and sand to a smooth finish. So that is this guy right here. So I think what happens is the A-arm right here, it actually hits that stop when the wheel's lowered down, thereby raising the truck. And so that's gonna get in the way of allowing us the full 2 inches. So we're just gonna cut that guy right off of the truck. So I'm gonna just move this out of the way. Should be interesting. Hopefully I don't light anything on fire with sparks. I'll show you once it's done. All right, that is gone. So I just kind of softened the edge a little bit, but pretty straightforward. I don't know if you can see that in there. It's getting kind of dark out here. But that should give us full range of motion here. All right, so I sort of screwed up with my recording because I put the thing all back together before I showed the finished product, but try to get in here. So as you can see, is bolts on the top, those are torqued down. The strut is back in place. All of the sway bar links and nuts and bolts are back in place. That bottom section was tough. I had to use a combination of 2 jacks and a pry bar to get those bolts lined up, and the air ratchet really helped out getting those in. Torqued down to 156 foot-pounds of torque, the axle nut, and then retied up the ABS line and the brake line. All of the ball joints are back in. As you can see, obviously the angle's changed a little bit, but it's not terrible. It's only a 2-inch lift, so none of these angles are that terrible. But if you're concerned about that, I mean, they do sell the A-arms that drop a little further to help that out a bit. Torque down the tire to 100 foot-pounds, and we're back. So now just want to remeasure and see kind of where we're at in the fender. I don't remember where we were before, but on this side, we are now at just under 139 to the ground. I think we were just above 139, so I gained only about 1 inch. This kind of sucks, but you know, I haven't done the other side yet, and definitely looks more level than it was. Not perfect, but good enough. All right, we are about to start the driver's side. I did it a little backwards. I did the passenger side first just because it was closer to my garage slash man cave. And so now I am working on the driver's side. I'm just going to take a quick measurement. I don't know if we did this at the beginning, but I think we did. We had a few days of rain, so I kind of got stuck in pause mode because I was getting soaked the other day. But as you can see, it's about 138 and just over a quarter to the top, to the fender from the center line. So we will go ahead and start the process. It should be very similar. I'm gonna jack it up, take the tire off, take the axle nut off, take the sway bar link out, take the traction bar link out, take the ABS lines off, pull the strut out, compress the strut, put the top on the strut, cut the bolts, mount the spacer to the strut, put the strut back in, reconnect everything, put the tire back on, and we should be good to go. So that's the basic process. We'll walk you through. All right, we got the tire off. Also, I forgot to mention earlier in the video, don't forget to mark your strut before you go compress it and take it out. I mean, you could do this as a second step, but as a last step, but I basically wanted to have this all marked up. And one trick that I learned is when you come down to the bottom, the orientation of the bottom of the strut can help with the orientation of your mark. So try to line your mark up with the bolt. And then when you go 180 degrees, you gotta be pretty close in order to get these things lined up when you put this back in the truck. So when you go 180 degrees with the strut, you can line that mark up with the other bolt, and you should be dead on. Obviously using your red marks or whatever color you use. Again, this green mark is just from the factory, but mine are the red marks. And again, 180 degrees from the bolt would help. I learned that from the other side because mine weren't quite lined up. And I almost had to repress the strut, but I ended up getting the bolt started, and it obviously pulls it back in line when you use an impact wrench, so I lucked out. So now we're gonna remove, again, the ABS line, the brake line bracket. We're not removing the actual brakes. We're gonna remove the axle nut and this bar here, I don't remember what it's called, and the torsion bar here from the bottom of the A. And then this whole apparatus should drop down. We'll remove this guy, but not all the way. And this whole thing should drop down, giving us access to our strut that we need to take out. All right, we got all of the brackets off. There's one here, one up here, and there's one on the back here. Let me see if I can get it. One here, this bracket here. So that just leaves everything loose. You know, it can kind of hang down. We're not gonna be moving the brakes at all. So everything can just hang there. It just gives us a little bit more play. We are now gonna take the tie rod off. So for this, you wanna loosen this nut. You wanna whack this with a hammer just to break this loose. This may drop on its own. So be careful when you loosen this up because it is gonna wanna drop a little bit, not too much because you do still have the strut in there. More so that happens on the top one, but I wish I could set this up and show you, but I'll have to show you once it's done. All right, tie rod is now removed. You can see it just kind of hangs loose here. Just hang that out of the way. Be careful when you're wrapping on this thing not to hit this boot. The directions say it, so if you're following the instructions, it will say it, but just be careful not to hit this boot because you want the grease that's in here to stay in there. As you can see, it creates a nice seal on the top here for lubrication of this joint. All right, so let's see, next step is gonna be remove the axle nut. Again, just to give us a little bit more play in the turning radius here, get that boot out of the way. So again, this one takes the special tool. It is a 36 millimeter axle hub socket, so it's hefty, it's pretty big. So if you don't have one of these, I think you can rent them at like AutoZone or O'Reilly's or something like that, but I just went ahead and bought the kit. So definitely pick one of those up before you start this process, or you're gonna come to a halt pretty quick. All right, axle nut removed. Now we're gonna take the sway bar link nut off of the bottom arm here. So this is your sway bar link. The nut is underneath here. You do need an 18 millimeter deep socket for this. 18 millimeter deep socket. If you don't have the deep socket, you will never reach that nut. It has this little nub here. I mean, I guess you could cut that off, but you probably don't want to do that. So definitely get a deep socket before you start this process. All right, that one's off. All right, so great example of why you don't want to remove that little nub from the bottom. You may have to use an adjustable or an open end to hold that. It's not really in focus here. To hold that while you loosen the nut, because this wants to spin, you know, in here. With the top connected, it's not as big of a deal. You can pretty much get it, but that's why that's there. So again, just be careful with that. All right, the next step is to loosen, come on, there we go, to loosen this nut, but do not remove it, because what we're gonna do is gonna bang on this. Now the weight of this whole apparatus may drop this without you having to hit it. Depends on how old your truck is, you know, what kind of wear and tear you put on it, weight and all that. But most newer trucks, this being a 2020, this is just gonna pop right off as soon as I loosen this nut. So I don't wanna take this completely off. I want to just slowly loosen it, leave it on the end, hit this so it drops down off of the ball joint, And then we can go ahead and remove this in a more controlled manner with either an adjustable or an open-ended wrench. So that's our next step. All right, as you can see, we got that removed now. Again, don't loosen the nut all the way, loosen it to the end, hit this with a hammer. That'll pop off, you'll see it pop off and reattach the nut. Then you can unscrew the nut slowly with an open-ended wrench, and then this should come off nice and gently. And then this whole apparatus just kind of swings out of the way. Again, the axle and the sway bar kind of hold on to each other, so you don't really have to worry about any of the lines or anything here as long as you put it to the right side. Now that gives us access to our strut apparatus. So our next step is going to be removing the 3 18mm nuts up here. There is a plastic thing over these, so I'm gonna have to figure out how to take that off, but I think it just snaps right off on this whole plastic wire harness holder, or I guess you call it. And then we should be able to take those off with open-ended wrench. So we're gonna give that a shot. Okay, as you can see, I got the nuts off of the top of the strut here. That plastic piece, by the way, just kind of pulls right up, snaps right off. I just used a pry bar just to pry it up over the things. There was one more plastic piece on this side here. Where is it? Right here. That just sat on top of the post there. So again, you just pry that off and then pry this one off that post, and then this whole thing moves out of the way. On the driver's side, you can actually reach the back post with a long open-ended 18mm wrench, and then these two obviously you can reach with the open-ended wrench too. You could maybe get a ratchet up there if you had one with like a bendable handle on it. I know they make those. I know Snap-on makes some of those. So that would actually work really well here, because you could be like down here and just ratchet it out. But I ended up using this little short stubby one, which was a pain in the ass, but is what it is. I also put a jack stand just underneath the lower A-arm here so that this whole thing just didn't drop real quick, just to give it a little support, because once you remove those three, there's nothing really holding this thing up. So I just threw that there just so it didn't slam down. So it's just another little trick that's worth it. Now I'm going to remove these two lower bolts and remove the strut. All right, here we are back in the garage again. Some of this stuff out of the way here. So we got the strut here. Again, we're gonna have to measure these bolts once the spacer is on here. Mark them, cut the ends off, mount the spacer with the supplied nuts, and then put the whole strut assembly back into the vehicle. Oh, actually, I'm sorry. After that, you're gonna have to compress the strut, spin it 180 degrees. Remember, we made a mark right here to kind of show us where that is. So we'll go ahead and spin that around 180 degrees. I think just the spring spins, so these marks will stay right where they are. This might spin, but that doesn't matter. But this needs to be on the complete opposite side of these marks when we're done. So we'll use the spring compressors to do that. Again, remember, that's the dangerous part. So if you're not comfortable doing it, I highly recommend that you bring this to a suspension shop and have them make the rotation for you and then give it back the strut. So if you're gonna do it that way, you may wanna remove both sides of your vehicle at the same time. Just put the thing on jack stands, remove both struts, take them both down to the transmission shop, not the transmission shop, the suspension shop, have them compress your strings, rotate them, bring them back, and then put everything back together. If you don't do that, again, these tabs are angled, and because this isn't a straight through, this will never go back in the car. An alternative option, and I don't know if these match up, I'm pretty sure they do, driver side to passenger side, but another option instead of rotating this is just to flip-flop the sides. Put the driver side on the passenger side on the driver, and these tabs should be opposite when you do it that way. So again, I haven't tested that method because the instructions do say to rotate it, so I've just been doing it based on the instructions in the Tuff Country 2-inch leveling kit. So I'm gonna stick with that. So I'll be back in just a moment once I get that spacer on. All right, as you can see, my spacer is in. Let me tilt this down for you so you can see. Spacer is in, bolts are flush. Loctite and nuts are on, torque to 45 foot-pounds to keep the spacer on. I went ahead and compressed the spring with these spring compressors and then rotated it 180 degrees so you can see my original marks here. I turn it, you can see the mark on the spring here, 180 degrees. And again, remember I said line it up with these to make it easier. So you you have two reference points basically, one here and then one with the other mark. And if you take your fingers and kind of like put them together, you know, like that on the either side of the shock, like if you go like this and then put your finger on the other side, it's a little easier to see. It's just got to be close. I mean, you're going to be able to get the nut in, and then it'll twist a little bit when you torque the nut down here, if it's just a little off, but there's a little bit of play in these anyway, so that's for a good reason. So get it super close as possible, but just know that if you're like a degree off, it's not going to ruin your life. So that's with the strut. Now we got to go put it back in the truck. We got to use these lock nuts, washer, lock washer, and the bolts that came in the kit. These go into the top here once in the truck, back in its mount point. So I'm gonna go do that. All right, got the strut back in the truck again. The new bolts on the top are 45 foot-pounds of torque, which actually isn't that much, but that's what it calls for. And then the bottom bolts, which are underneath 15 mil, are 56 foot-pounds of torque. Again, done with a torque wrench. So I just snug them up and finish them off with the torque wrench, 56 foot-pounds of torque. Now I gotta hook up the upper ball joint, the lower tie rod, and the sway bar link there, to finish off this job, and then put the brackets back onto the knuckles once they're in place. Then the axle nut, torqued down to 156 foot-pounds of torque, and then obviously the tire, and that's 140 foot-pounds of torque on the tire lugs. All right, guys, strut is in. Sorry about the air compressor. Strut is in, spacer is in, all the brackets are back on. All the connectors all torqued down. Bottom bolts, tie rod, top bolts, everything looks good. It's still jacked up, so the angle looks kind of steep right now, but once it's down on the ground, I'll show you that angle again. Axle nut back on, 156 foot-pounds. Now we're just gonna throw the tire back on and we'll call this one done. And final test, right down the center line, like 39 3/4. We were just above 38. So yeah, based on the slope of the driveway, about 1.5 inches, it looks like, on both sides. Which isn't quite the 2 advertised, but see if I can back up a little bit and show you how she looks. Definitely, I can't get an angle. Definitely much more level looking than she was. A little extra space in those front wheels, so awesome. Let's call that one a wrap. And if you have any questions, comment below. I'll try to respond to them. Again, my name is Matt, and I am not a mechanic, but this was a driveway install of the 2-inch leveling kit for a 2019, 2020, 2021 Chevy Silverado 1500. This is the diesel model.